Alrighty, gang. Here's to nights that turn into mornings and friends that turn into family. Cheers!
Happy birthday to you.
Hello. Welcome to the Friendship IRL podcast. I'm your host, Alex Alexander, and each week we explore what's working and what's not in our friendships, community, and connections. Have you ever wished you could sit down and have a conversation about what is really going on in your friendships? Well, you found your people. Join us as we dive into real-life stories and explore new ways to approach these connections. Together, we're reimagining the rules of friendship. Today, we're diving into a topic that I know will resonate with so many of you. We're talking about breaking free from one-sided connections and learning to truly receive support. If you've ever found yourself in the role of constantly being the listener or the fixer in your friendships or your connections in general, then this episode is a must listen. Like, we've all been there, right? That feeling that you are always the one that is giving, the shoulder to cry on, and then rarely feeling like you have somewhere to turn yourself. Like, I'll be honest with you, I have caught myself in this pattern before. For the longest time, I used to brag about how good I was at dropping everything to help a friend in need. And I always felt like my friends weren't quite reciprocating the same way. Now, what I discovered when I started to dig deep is that I was a huge part of this problem. I had created and was maintaining this dynamic. And here's the thing, I think that this is a common pattern. It's not something that I did wrong or that you did wrong. We shouldn't be beating ourselves up about this. The most important thing we can do is recognize it and decide to do the work to slowly shift it. And that's exactly what we're exploring in today's episode. Our guest today has been on her own powerful journey of unraveling these one-sided connections and learning to allow others to truly see and support her. She's going to share some incredible practical tips on building a diverse support network, embracing small talk and playfulness, and perhaps most importantly, reclaiming your own needs in relationships. If you are ready to break free from these patterns that are probably draining you and create more fulfilling connections, you're in the right place. This episode is all about doing the work to shift these dynamics and to start creating what you need in your relationships. So before we dive in, let me introduce you to our amazing guest today. Chrissy Marie is a trauma-informed embodiment practitioner and inner child liberator. She's the founder of the Art of Aliveness podcast and is known for helping high achievers grow up their inner people pleaser, take themselves less seriously, and prosper by making play and simplicity a priority. Now, this is a jam-packed episode. I don't need to talk any longer. Let's just get to it. Chrissy, it's so nice to see you today.
I'm so happy to be here.
I am so excited about our conversation. And when we had previously chatted, I know we kind of talked a lot about making connections as an introvert, but I really think that this applies on whatever level to everyone, because I was reviewing our discovery call. And even as somebody who I would say I'm pretty far on the extroverted scale, I think so many things are going to apply today. Like, they apply to me. I've experienced a lot of these same things. So thank you for bringing this topic to the podcast. Where I'm kind of hoping we can go today is talking about this idea of one-sided connections. And people are going to hear that and maybe assume, there's a lot of conversation out there about one-sided connections where somebody is giving or like asking a lot from you. But your take on it was that you actually realized that you were kind of blocking yourself from connection. And that although maybe from the outside, people might have thought like, oh, this other friend, these people are taking so much from you. You realize that like part of it was you allowing it. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you found yourself experiencing?
Yeah, 100%. Pleasure to be here, by the way. Excited to dive in. So the Spark Notes version of this is part of my conditioning growing up. Was I learned to pattern being a space holder, being a really deep listener, being a safe person for other people with intimacy and connection. And I found that because I was able to hold space for a lot of people's range and different experiences, and I wasn't very reactionary, or if that's the word. I was very calm when people would tell me very difficult things. And because of that, people would open up to me. And in that opening, in their opening, I felt a lot of connection and intimacy. And it filled this longing I had for that. However, I really anchored into that as a role, like that this is who I am. I am the space holder. I am the one who does the listening, the holding, the caring for, the advice giving, whatever it is that people need. And I never really learned or felt safe in allowing other people to hold me for a number of reasons. One, I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. And two, it wasn't immediately offered. So I didn't even know exactly what it was that I needed. I just knew that what I was getting back from my friendships didn't feel good. A lot of commiserating, a lot of advice giving, a lot of other people making my stories about them and trying to connect with me by telling me a story about their life. And none of it felt really good, but I didn't know how to ask for what I wanted, nor did I really even feel safe in revealing the depths of my discomfort or my pain, the parts of me that felt really sticky. I didn't feel comfortable sharing them with other people because I wasn't fully comfortable with them in myself. Like that relationship, of that self to self relationship was pretty shaky. So I would keep a lot of myself inside for fear that if people were to see it, I would lose connection with them. I would drive them away, or they wouldn't know how to hold me, and it would be more painful than if I had just kept it to myself.
I think, like I said in the beginning, so many people are going to hear that, be in their car, on a walk with their AirPods, be like, yes, yes. I have heard this in talking to people on this podcast so many times that somehow we find ourselves in this role. And I was thinking while you were talking that I think a lot of people are going to hear that and think that mostly female identifying people think that this is more of a problem for them. I think it's just depends on the context. Like I think women end up being a lot of the listeners. And I think men end up kind of filling a similar role, but in this, like, let me dump all my problems so you can solve them role. Like I think this is happening to everyone.
Absolutely. I think it's a human issue. And we can go into the structure pieces that I've spoken to, but it's definitely not something I learned in school, like how to create safety in relationship, how to create consent in conversation when sharing difficult things. Like that's something I had to learn much later in my life.
You've kind of always done this, you said, but when this pattern started developing, did you find that maybe in the beginning it was like less intense, less overwhelming, less vulnerable shares, and then it like built up? As I guess what I'm trying to say is over time, as you kind of became known as this person who would listen and take on like the deepest stuff, did that mean that people would come to you and just immediately go to the deepest thing? Or do you think it's always been that way?
As far as I can remember, it's always felt like that. And I think part of that is it's part of my constitution. It's like, it's the kind of the frequency or the reference point I hold for people. It's like that steady, safe space. And a lot of people don't have that. I'm a therapist as well. So like clearly I stepped into that role professionally because I was like, this is part of my design. So it definitely felt like I was always that person. And I think it's because also I hold a very high standard for curiosity and compassion. And people are craving that. Like they're just craving to be met in a unconditionally, non-judgmental, held in positive regard.
Yeah, I was mainly just wondering because I think that sometimes, especially in groups of friends or friends of friends, the more you kind of become known as something, the quicker everybody is to ask you for that form of support. And in some cases, that's actually kind of nice. Like I've talked about this before, right? I love to cook. I really enjoy it. It's fun for me. So we've gotten to this point where people know that's the way I love to give support, so they will ask for it. And I think that that's actually kind of beautiful because it's something I really enjoy. It makes me happy while I do it. And that's not to say that listening to people doesn't make you happy, but it's just a really overwhelming thing. And the more we become like known for providing support in a certain way, I think we get deeper and deeper in where it's hard to get out. It's hard to change that we are the friend who will always listen to the deepest stuff that you can call anytime and dump this stuff on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think people find themselves in this situation where they want to show up for people, but they've never really taken the time to think about the ways they've ended up being everyone's support. And, you were talking in the beginning about like that self-reflection piece. That's really where it is for me, is like taking the time to look at yourself and say, do I even want to show up in these ways? Do I have capacity? Maybe I can do it sometimes and I can't do it others. This is too draining for me. My life stage at this moment doesn't allow for this, whatever it is.
Definitely. And I definitely enabled it for years and years, through that exact path of just continuing to offer myself in that way and be that person and never say, hey, I don't have the capacity. Like I would always, like for the most part, in terms of my memory, I would always show up for people, even if it was at the expense of my sleep or my focus or my energy.
In the introduction to this episode, I shared that I used to find myself in this pattern where I was dropping everything for everyone else, not very good at setting boundaries. And I also would rarely ask for help in return. So it just felt like this really one-sided pattern. And when I recognized it, I knew I had to shift it. But I want to address a worry that I think some of you might have. I know I had. And that was, I was really worried that if I pulled back, like, would my friends be angry? Would they be frustrated that I wasn't showing up in this overwhelming, probably, way in their lives? Like, I've been showing up this way for a really long time, but you want to know what? There was not a single friend who pushed back. And my friends actually applauded me, congratulated me, encouraged me. They had seen that I was overextending myself for a long time, and they wanted me to take better care of myself in our friendships. Now, your experience might be different. I don't know, but I just want to tell you that if that is a worry, I would let it go. Because if they are supportive friends who respect your boundaries and are positive in your life and want you to grow and thrive, they are going to be respectful of the fact that you need to pull back. And I hope that you do that for yourself. Before we get back in, a little foreshadowing, Chrissy and I are going to dive into talking about small intimacies, which is a topic I talk about here all the time. So I just want to remind you, there is an entire episode. If what you are about to hear resonates with you and you want to dive deeper into it, head to episode 74, all about small intimacies, and that's what you'll find there. You and me both. I very much identify with that. I get that. When I talk about like vulnerability and intimacy in friendships, I talk about something called big intimacies and small intimacies. So big intimacies are, first of all, everybody gets to decide what is a big versus a small intimacy. It's going to be different for everybody. But the big ones are like the riskiest ones, the deepest ones, the most intense ones. that kind of stuff. The little ones are things that feel a little risky to share with someone, but aren't really that consequential. Like maybe being silly or offering a compliment or telling someone how much you enjoy spending time with them or inviting someone into your home. Now, that might be a big intimacy, but for me, it's a small one. Like introducing someone to a partner. All these ways you can kind of allow someone into your life, but not going straight for the deepest thing. Did you find that when you had kind of fallen into this role, like were you sharing any part of yourself? Like even the little things, were you allowing people in there?
Yeah. So ironically, I am quite and have been an open book, and I would share some pretty deep things. I wouldn't hold back on context. It was the felt sense. It was allowing people to see me in a state of nervous system dysregulation that I was not allowing. I would let people know of things that have happened to me and of things that I was contemplating. And yeah, people knew. They just couldn't feel me because I wasn't feeling in front of anybody. There was so much space between what I was choosing to share and how it was impacting me personally for the most part.
I very much identify with that. I get what you're saying. For anybody that's listening, I think I get what you're saying and is confused what the difference is. It's like when I say, my mom has died. Like that's a fact. I'm letting people in. I think this is what you're trying to say. But actually talking about how that's affected me or what that feels like on the day-to-day or the days where I'm sad, allowing someone to know that I'm sad and see how that's affecting me are two different things. So like while I might state the fact, actually allowing them in, like you're saying, to see the feelings is so different. Does that sound about right for you?
Absolutely. And I'm going to share it just because it's bubbling up right now. So it feels like it's relevant. In partnership and in some friendships, I would lead with my trauma in order to create connection, in order to even just to be a permission piece for others to like open up. But it wasn't like I had an agenda. It was like, I'm leading with my trauma so that you feel safe to share with me, so that I feel close to you. And also maybe in my early 20s, especially, so that you feel some sort of like empathy for me or like you feel some sort of way for me. And I have compassion for that part of myself because again, she was just trying to connect the way that she knew best. But it wasn't boundaried. Like there wasn't a conversation around like opening up to what that meant to share those deep details and to receive them from other people. It felt more transactional than it did intimate in my personal experience. Like, I don't know how others received that, but I knew what I was doing. It was very intentional. And again, it was just another way in which I could control intimacy and not feel vulnerable in front of other people.
Well, I was going to say the control thing popped up in my mind. Yeah. Like I talk about this a lot on the podcast, this idea that we're trying to anticipate how we want someone to react and then work backwards for our actions that will get them there. And although you weren't maybe necessarily doing that every time, like you were saying, the empathy piece, like you wanted people to feel connected. You wanted people to see you as open. Like you had these plans. So you said certain things. Then when we know how people react, especially in moments where you're meeting someone newer or you're trying to get to know someone and it's awkward, it can be so easy to just fall into that pattern because you know with pretty high certainty what the outcome is going to be. And that gives us a lot of comfort. And then we end up repeating the same patterns over and over and over again.
Yeah. And it would often lead to relationships where the standard of connection was around trauma bonding and commiserating and offering each other advice or trying to fix. And we would kind of step into these roles where we were just trying to be the thing for others that we really needed for ourselves, in my, experience. And there was never really a sense of like that deep, sovereign, I'm okay with you exactly where you are, and I'm okay with me exactly where I am. And we're sharing, but there's this sense of like, I'm not trying to fix you. I don't need you to be different. And that's something, again, that I had to learn along the way.
Okay. So now that we've kind of covered what was happening here to some extent, did you have like this big aha realization? Was it slow over time? Like, let's talk about how you got out of this pattern and maybe like where you've gone with this instead.
So there's a couple things. There was a big watershed moment at an event that I went to. It was a leadership weekend where there was a lot of intense somatic processing. And one of the exercises had to do with being seen in vulnerability. Many of them, actually. Many of them. And I put myself there knowing that that's what I needed. I needed to be cracked in a safe place. And I had an experience of crying so hard, like just like the visceral sobs, in front of a room full of people I just met like a couple days prior. And I was able to feel that unconditional acceptance and that unconditional sense of, I don't need you to be different, Chrissy. I don't need you to be the strong one, the stable one, the calm one. It's okay to be exactly where you're at right now. And that rewired something in my brain around intimacy and safety when it came to opening and sharing myself like that in front of other people. So that was a really special moment for me. And everybody's journey with that will be different, but I do believe it's really important to put yourself in containers, support containers where people are trained to hold space for you. I think that can really be powerful in allowing you to create that sense of internalized safety. And then also my training, and I got my master's in social work. So a lot of my training is in space holding. And there have been so many moments, one in particular, where I volunteered to get to the front of the class and do this mock engagement with a mock client. And this client was getting upset. And I just practiced kind of staying stoic and just meeting them exactly where they were and validating exactly what they were experiencing. And the teacher afterwards said that it's so important that I didn't go into trying to fix the person or trying to negate how they were feeling, that meeting them right where they're at is exactly what most people need. And that moment really shifted things for me. And there were many other small teachable moments along the way. But what I learned is that, one, trying to be the fixer wasn't actually supporting people around me, nor was it supporting my capacity to connect with them. And two, that's when I realized, oh, that's what I need. That's what I want. I just want somebody to sit with me and say, I see you. And your emotions are not a burden. And I don't need you to be any different. And let me know what you need to hear from me. And so I started to gather these reference points of what real intimacy for me personally actually is and feels like and sounds like and looks like. And then I started incorporating that into the way I was engaging with the people in my life.
That is a very parallel journey to my journey. And mainly just, I was going to say the idea that, like, I think you're right. If your main way of connecting is holding space for everybody else, being that container, that listener, that people pleaser, like repeating these patterns, you have to go somewhere in a safe container and like release some of that. For me, it's been regular therapy. And then once you start to do that, it's then like taking it outside of that container and starting to practice it in everyday life, like allowing yourself to be seen in small ways, allowing people to listen to you, asking for that. So it sounds like we've had a very, very similar journey in that sense. And like for anybody listening, like it doesn't happen overnight. It's such a practice of unraveling this. And you just smiled and people can't see the video, but yeah. I'm guessing that was your experience as well.
Definitely long, drawn out, slow, still very much in it. Like still, I just received a really beautiful message from a friend a couple days ago. And it's just like, there's still those parts of me that kind of quiver around depth of connection and are like, oh my gosh, is this okay to feel this big for somebody? And part of that, I think, is fear of loss. There's a grief element that's present for me around like fully opening to somebody, because once you open to like the bliss of deep connection, you are also opening to the pain of that connection transitioning. Yep. Right. And there's this process of like releasing my attachment to how long I feel this way for somebody and what it's going to look like in the future. But to go back to like the arc, like the nonlinear journey of learning how to feel safer with myself and thus with others, part of it was learning, one, that it's important when people are opening up to you to not feel like you need to have the right answer. And to, for me at least, to remember that people know what they need if they give themselves enough space and time to consider that. And so instead of trying to step into the role of being everything for everybody, I started asking people what would feel good to receive as a response to this share. And then putting the ball back in their court. And then if it feels in alignment, offering that. And then conversely, if I'm wanting to share with somebody who I feel might be a safe space, asking, hey, I've got some stuff. I don't need advice. It would be nice to hear that it makes sense, what I'm feeling. Are you willing to listen for 5 minutes and then offer that as a reflection? And being okay with whatever answer I get.
Yeah. Like having some sense, again, with that, like beginning with you piece of it, not just it's all about them. Like you're starting with what you want and then including them in it. I think that's a great way of looking at it. Do you have any other like tangible examples of how you in practice and like day-to-day life, things that you did that started to help you unravel this and change your patterns and do things differently to create what you needed?
So one of the examples I think I mentioned to you when we were chatting before is I started hosting these gatherings at my house, these fire circles, where I would invite my friends over, and the intention would be to connect around insight, inspiration, and challenge, but with the very clear expectation or standard, even agreement, and nobody's fixing anybody. There's nothing that needs to be changed. What we would do is I'd have people over, we'd like casually like have some snacks and stuff, and then we'd gather around a fire in the backyard, and I'd guide them through like a gentle meditation where we'd consider what it is we're looking to embody or step into, and then anything that's challenging for us that we'd like to name and offer up to the fire. And for me, this was a practice of facilitating a space with clear boundaries, stating what I wanted from the gathering, which was for it not to be a commiserating, non-structured space, and also to be witnessed as part of that. So not only was I holding the space, but I was also sharing my stuff, knowing that I'm setting the standard of nobody's going to offer me advice. Nobody's going to make it about them. We're all just going to take our turns and get to connect and be seen and witnessed in a really simple and potent way. So I would do things like that. And then also I would sign up for sessions with people who I felt like I could unravel around. And I would gift myself more and more of those experiences, like the one I had at that leadership space. I would find people who could do what I needed them to do for me, and I would invest in them. And what's really beautiful is that many of those people recognized my capacity to do what they did as well. And what's lovely is that, and this is not for everybody, but a lot of those paid exchanges turned into friendships where now we have agreements where it's like, hey, if you need me to hold space for you, you don't need to pay me. I'm going to keep a session with you in retainer. And we would just kind of exchange these space holding calls because I started to meet people who were a match in terms of that skill and that capacity. And that I started to build a body of connections that could offer me exactly what it was that I needed. And back to the big intimacies, little intimacies, I think there's also like different levels of friendship. There's like the friends you go on your hikes with and, you know, you invite over your house for board games and stuff. And then there are the friends you call and say, hey, I am chewing on some stuff right now. And are you willing to hold me for 45 minutes, knowing that I will do the same for you in that season of your life when it comes up?
In my book, that will be available to you very soon, in my book, I do discuss the idea of finding support and including professional support in that. I don't know if I touch on that enough here on the podcast, but therapists, coaches, trainers, doctors, so on. These professionals are part of your community, of your support. Don't hesitate to fill in the gaps with professional support as you need it. Just wanted to acknowledge that. But I also want to call out this idea of kind of trading space with friends. I actually this morning was on a call with a friend who I would say is kind of one of those like hold space for me friends. And the reason I want to tell you about this call is because she's not one of my closest friends. In fact, she's an internet friend. I have never met her actually face to face in person. We talk a decent amount. We met through some work-related things. But we regularly connect. Like our main root, our main connection point is kind of this idea of mutually holding space for each other. And I think so often this idea of finding the people who will do this for us, who will hold space, is this idea that we need to find, right, those like peak friendships, the closest, truest, realest, best friends, and then they will do that. And they do, like my closest friends do hold space, absolutely. But I'm also out here like living life with my closest friends, making memories, having fun, taking care of each other. I'm like doing all these other things. And that deep trading support isn't like 100% of our friendship. Sometimes it just kind of gets like shoved in to a part of the conversation, maybe where you're like walking for 5 minutes from one thing you're doing with them to another. And that's great. And that's fine. But if you have this vision that the only place you can find these hold space friends is in those, whatever you see as your peak closest friendship, I'm just here to tell you, you might be able to find, I mean, in my mind, more of like a defined friendship. That is what this internet friend and I that I met with this morning, I would say she's kind of a defined friend. We talk about work and we kind of do this holding space thing. That's it. We're not very integrated in the rest of our lives, but we hold space for each other so beautifully and it's so impactful. So don't cheat yourself of that if you find one of those people. Allow that type of connection in your life. Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about just building yourself a broad support system, that these friendships don't need to be all or nothing, that your closest people might be able to hold you in certain ways and they may not be the best people in others, and going out there and finding the right people for that, whether they are your closest friends or they're somebody in a group or they do this professionally. You can fill all your roles, and what your roles are going to be different than what my roles are. And my roles right now are going to be different than in another season of life. So I totally think you're right, which goes back to that idea of kind of starting with yourself and having some sense of what roles you can fill for others, what roles you might need in your life, and paying attention to like the makeup of that over time.
Yeah. And yeah, I feel like I glossed over like such an important part, which is my personal journey with like reparenting the child inside me that felt unsafe to express. And for me, there's so many things I can share, and I'm happy to share some resources with your listeners. We can link to some of my YouTube stuff or meditations.
Yeah, definitely.
But I went through a pretty powerful process in my early 20s around connecting to my inner child, where I would journal with her. I would sit in front of the mirror and I would have conversations and I would let her speak. And then I would ask questions and we'd go back and forth. And there were many, many moments where I met the edges of myself. I met the parts of me that were like, is it okay to scream? Is it okay to cry? And I started building a connection to the part of me that knew how to hold the rest of me. You know, there's so much soup inside of us as humans, but I also believe like we are also at the center, at the core of ourselves. We have like a bowl that can hold the soup. And so for me, it was about connecting to that bowl, that my own space holder for self, and learning how to hold myself in so many different expressions of life. And the more okay I became with those expressions, the easier it was for me to allow other people to see those expressions. And it's like a chicken and egg situation. Like, I don't know what came first, but I think both needed to happen around the same time. This process of learning how to hold self, as well as meeting people who knew how to do really powerful holding.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like you said, it's like a chicken or the egg, right? There's some stuff out there which I don't like. I'll say that up front. I don't like that says, like you need to know how to love yourself before you can be loved. And I think that's not correct. Like it's just a never ending process. And sometimes you unravel a piece of yourself on your own, and that allows you to connect more deeply with the people around you. And sometimes people around you are connecting deeply with you. And that's what sends you back to yourself. And it's never necessarily one way or the other. It's like you were saying, like both simultaneously or twice one way and once the other. Like it just constantly is evolving. And that's what allows you to connect deeper, is like tuning in to both sets of cues.
Definitely. And a lot of people don't have role models of what healthy relating looks like. That's why I think therapy or coaching or whatever, finding your person and shopping around for that right person is so important. Because if you didn't learn how to co-regulate with your parents, if your parents weren't safe spaces for you, then you can still do it in adulthood. But it's important that you have that relational dynamic, that healthy relational dynamic. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's just, we're tribal beings, and we need those role models, those safe, healthy, stable figures to practice with until we can internalize a sense of safety for ourselves.
Yeah. Like I think you hit the nail on the head there especially related to friendship and community, I hear from so many people that their parents didn't have friends. They didn't go out and engage with community. They didn't talk about this or think about this. So for most people, for a lot of people, this wasn't modeled. You didn't see the process. And some of the self-work from that, can come from therapy and professionals and structured containers. I also think part of it is just deciding you are going to develop this for yourself and going out there and starting to meet people and like staying present in that as, you meet some people that will have already developed this in themselves, or they did see it modeled, and you can kind of learn from them. Other people aren't going to feel right. You're going to have to move on. I had somebody recently ask me, the best resources to learn, like how to go out there and connect and be in relationship with people. And I just was like, I think this is one of those things. You can watch all the YouTube videos you want. It's like me watching somebody work out on Instagram. Like that doesn't actually change my life. Mm-hmm. I have to go out there and start doing the thing. And I think this area of life is one of those areas. Like you just need to start going out there and kind of fumbling through it and figuring out what works for you.
Totally. I'll tell you one thing that really worked well for me is learning how to ask interesting questions, like questions that lead conversations into people's passions, what people are creating, what they're excited about, the last time they felt most alive, just like guiding the conversation towards things that I was really curious about. Whereas when I was young, like all I knew was how to relate around trauma and pain. And now I have a document of questions that I pull out when I'm feeling a little rusty or I'm going to a new gathering, and I just kind of review, and I get like, oh yeah, I'm going to ask this question and that question. And I just have them in my back pocket for if conversation feels a little stagnant and I want to spice things up a bit. So for me, as an introvert, especially, having some prompts was so helpful.
And I love that example for a variety of reasons. Like number one, so many people think of, like friendship and community and connection as this kind of romanticized thing. Like you'll just know how to do it. When in reality, it's a lot of habits and skills we teach ourselves. So you've decided to set yourself up for success. You've done kind of some homework. You've built this tool for yourself so that when you go out there, you aren't just winging it. You kind of have these things to pull out of your back pocket.
Yeah.
And in knowing that, your ultimate goal is to feel more connected, you've done this work to set yourself up for that. And I think so many people are just winging it, not reflecting, not thinking about it, not setting themselves up for success.
Yeah.
And it's such a beautiful example of a small way you've done that for yourself.
Definitely. If I'm not intentional, I can still have some interesting conversations, but that's only because I've had so much practice with it. In the beginning, I had to be so incredibly intentional. Like, why am I going out tonight? What am I looking to get out of this experience? If I meet somebody interesting, what would I want to do with them? That was another thing, is moving away from the party, going out to drink and socialize as the main thing that people do, starting to invite people out on hikes with me or on walks with me, or do you want to come over and craft with me? Inviting them into my world. That's another, back to your question around how did I pull them in? It's all just kind of flowing as we chat. Yeah. Inviting them into what I like to do, and then asking them what they like to do. And if we have a Venn diagram that overlaps, doing those joint activities together instead of just doing the autopilot thing. Nothing wrong with going out to eat and drinking, but I quit drinking a couple of years ago. It's not really the way that I like to socialize anymore. But I'm happy to go out dancing, go to a concert, do it, just finding other creative ways to connect with people and coexist with people.
Yeah. And what you've done here, right, is more of that. Set yourself up for success, built your toolkit, done some self-reflection. Mm-hmm. I use this analogy where if we were going to buy a new car, you walk outside and there's cars everywhere and it's overwhelming. It's there's a black car and a red car and a Mazda and a Honda and a this and a that. You're just inundated. But when you start to put filters out there, it's so much easier to start to notice the cars that fit your filters.
Yeah.
And I think that autopilot piece of people being out there just saying oh, I want to connect with who, to do what, to show up how, about what areas of life. And that's not to say they have to fit all those boxes, but I think you're right. When you go out and you start having these initial conversations with people, somebody says, oh, I love to hike all the time. And it's a buzzer goes off in your head of, oh, that is something I'm looking to do more with people. Mm-hmm. And it's not automatically that's going to become your new closest friend, but it's a filter that allows you to continue your conversations and kind of direct them in a certain way to figure out if it feels like a good fit to connect more or not.
Totally. And I think having the filter allows you to see more of what you're looking for. It's confirmation bias. If you are looking for one specific type of car, or you buy a car, you often find that you see it more on the road.
Yep.
It's top of mind, right? A lot of people I hear say, I just don't know where my people are. And I'll tell you, I did find a lot of them online. Yep. I did find a lot of them online. And even just when I first listened to your podcast, this is an example of something I've been doing for years now. If I feel resonance with somebody, I'll send them a message and I'll be like, hey, love what you're talking about. Would you like to do X? And I'm very clear, would you like to do X, Y, and Z? Or would you like to jump on a call and see how we might support each other? Or I started structuring my online calls with friends. I invite people into jumping on a call, and I've got at least 2 people that I do this every single month for 1 hour every month. This is the extent of our relationship, and it's so fulfilling. We jump on a Zoom and we share things that we're currently stretched by, insights that we've had over the month, and things that we're celebrating. And we just take turns and we witness each other, and we get so much out of listening to each other and then sharing. And that's the relationship, and it's structured, and I learned that from a friend who learned that from a friend. So I'm borrowing all of these things and I'm making them my own, and I'm working them into my new relationships in a way that feels good.
If I had to visualize what was just happening in this podcast episode, it was basically Chrissy was just standing there casually hanging out, and she was just reaching into her pocket and throwing gems around on the floor for us to notice. That was such a rich little section of this podcast. And I want to make sure we didn't miss anything. I want to point out what I hope you saw. The first thing is that she talked about approaching conversations with curiosity. And she even talked about this idea of creating a document to set yourself up for success, to help yourself with small talk, something you can review. I love that. Get over this idea that you just need to know. Set yourself up. Put a note in your phone. Open it up before you walk in a room. Give yourself a little support in these social situations. And if you want to dive deeper into this idea of approaching conversations with curiosity, head to episode 49, which is my survival guide to small talk. Second thing I want to note is that Chrissy touched on this idea of asking yourself questions before you head into a social situation. I do this too. I talk about it in episode 91, titled How to Stop Dreading Parties and Take Charge of Your Guest Experience. We will link all these in the show notes. You don't have to remember them, but go find that one if you need that. The final thing I want to touch on is this Zoom idea, like chef's kiss to this one. I hope some of you give this a try. Here is a structure you can use if you want to do this. Pick a handful of people, like curate a small group for some reason, some connection point they have, some way they see life, some belief, something. Pick a handful of people. Choose 3 questions. And these are going to become questions that you answer every time you get on a call, and then choose a regular cadence for the call. Weekly, bi-weekly, daily, I don't care, monthly. So you have a handful of people, you have 3 questions, and you have a regular cadence. And when you get on there, the whole goal is just to go around and have everybody answer those 3 questions. And for the first few times, that might be all people do. They might answer the question. You might say, this was lovely to hold space for each other, and end the call. But watch what it does for these connections if you do it for a while. Because this approach creates consistency and structure. You're kind of mimicking how we were all taught to originally make friends, right? Going to school and doing kind of the same things, or joining a community group where you showed up regularly and had the same activities and structure and things like that. I hope that some of you take this tool and this idea and use it to build some meaningful connections for yourself. Give it a try. And that's yet again another very tangible, beautiful example, especially for people who are out there shouting, where are my people? And it maybe centers around a specific area of life. Things that come to mind: small business owners, new parents, people who have recently made some big life transition, people who are in grief. It can be overwhelming when you're yelling, like, where are my people? Without those filters, and feeling like you need to find, maybe societal messages and mass media and social media will be like, you need to find this all-encompassing friend who also fills that one need. But what you're saying is kind of figure out what you want, structure it, and revel in that piece. It doesn't need to be all encompassing, and let go. It might just stay that way. It might develop into something more. Who knows? But right now it's like fulfilling this piece that you have, and you can do that. You can set that up for yourself.
Yeah. And you got to ask, and that's part of the inner work, is being willing to put the ask out there. And that could be in a group. It could be in like a support group for people you're looking to connect with. It could be in like a mutual interest group, online or in person. You do need to, at least in my process, I've needed to do a little bit of footwork. So for example, I moved to Alabama 2 years ago. I'm back in Rhode Island now, but I was there for a year and a half, knew nobody in the area. And so intentionally went and looked up, where's the nearest yoga studio? Is there any holistic wellness stuff going on? Started adding people on Facebook from those spaces. And then eventually that led to some connections where, we met, people messaged each other. We're like, do you want to get coffee? Do you want to talk about what you're working on? And for a couple weeks, I was like, am I going to meet anybody? Like, is this going to be weird? And I just had to be okay sitting in the unknown of that, of like, no, my people are here. I just have to keep calling to them. And if I don't show up and say, here I am, see me, does anybody resonate with me? Nobody's going to see me. Nobody's going to reach out. And so there is an element of visibility. And I think a lot of people struggle with that in particular. It's something I had to work through and continuing to work through, but that could be a whole other podcast around like making yourself visible so that your people can find you as well.
But I think it ties in kind of to the overall topic we've been talking about, which is unblocking yourself from connection. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need to be you throw the curtain open on everything. It can be kind of like offering these bridges for people to connect with you in ways that feel right. So if you are somebody who either, for whatever your life circumstances are, feel not seen, feel like it's hard to let yourself out there, you don't have to throw the curtain open. You can pick certain bridges. If that's actually meeting new people, making even just like basic connections, people to go to yoga with, mm-hmm. people that live nearby you that you enjoy walking with. It doesn't have to be the deepest of things.
Yeah.
You are finding the bridges. You're picking them. And that's the beautiful thing here.
Yes. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. Cause some of my deepest connections are built over those tiny moments of just mm-hmm. small talk, right? It doesn't have to go right into the deep talk. That's something I've learned is the importance of small talk and being okay with that. Even though I'm somebody who loves to dive into deeper things, there's a beauty in kind of massaging the surface. And like, it's a little bit of like relationship foreplay, it's like, there's something sacred about that. And slowing down the connections and being patient and kind of like watering the garden. And yeah, those just like that gentle tending can eventually, not always, but can eventually lead to some really, really beautiful relationships with people who you may not have thought you would connect with in the first place too. I've always found that to be interesting as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I have so many of those. Yeah. And I don't know if I always think we're talking, maybe about a similar thing, but it goes back to that kind of small intimacies. Like somewhere along the line, we've been told that only certain things count as letting someone in, which is why I really like to talk about this idea. Like when you're talking about the surface level stuff, there's something intimate and beautiful about talking about the random stuff.
Yeah.
The stuff that went through your head that is just kind of silly and mundane and doesn't have this greater impact, that we really feel like we have to save for our closest people, because why would anyone else want to hear that? Mm. But there's also something great about talking about it with maybe our simpler connections, because we never know. We don't know them well enough to know what they're going to connect with us over. We might tell some silly story about like the squirrels in my backyard, and they may totally go off about that.
Yep.
But I think societal messages really tell us that we have to save that. Nobody would want to hear that, but my husband will listen to it or my best friend will listen to it. And I just don't think that's true.
I agree.
And that those are sometimes like the most fun conversations, because as you get down the line, you're like, how did we even get here? And you've learned 20 new random facts about this person.
Yes. Yes. I love that. I love that so much. There is something familial about that. Like for mm-hmm. me, when people just share those like little things about their life, that's not actually an active practice of mine. So I'm glad you brought it up. I've been working more on just bringing people into tiny little snippets of my life. Mm-hmm. Like, I believe we're inherently storytellers and we love stories, and so for me, that there's a love language in that, like sharing those little moments throughout the day that we might think are like mundane or minuscule, but actually feel quite relational to others when they receive it.
Some way, shape, or form, we've been told to like only look for certain things as intimacy. And it's like this narrower definition that it needs to be, that really there's this broad spectrum of ways we're trying to let each other in. but we just aren't noticing it because we've been told those don't matter or they're not impactful. But like we get to decide what is worth noticing, what shows that somebody's trying to let us in. And it can be the deepest things. It can be the silly things. It can be the mundane everyday things. Like we can choose this broader definition and realize that we're a lot more connected with people than we initially thought.
Absolutely. And as you're speaking, it's reminding me that, a lot of people, there's various degrees to which people experience intimacy in their sharing. So like me sharing something mundane with you might not feel very like big for me, but it might feel big for you to share that with me. Right. And so it's very subjective. And I think having a conversation too with my friends has been helpful around like, how do you like to receive care and love? Or what do you value in friendship? That's one of the questions I like to keep in my back pocket. It's like, what do you value in friendship? What is it about friendship that makes it special for you? Or what do you like to do with your friends? How do you like to receive connection? And, I've got some friends who are like, I just want you to send me playlists or book recommendations or funny memes and that's how we keep our friendship alive until we see each other in the flesh again. And for me, it's like, well, I like to hear what you appreciate about me from time to time or things like that, so starting to remember everybody's got a different love language and a different degree to which they experience intimacy in their sharing. So I think that's a great point.
Yes, 100%. And looking for that, like asking directly, but also maybe sometimes I think we can see it when they share the silly story.
Yeah.
Like they're happy they shared it and we can notice like, oh, they were offering that to try and connect with me. Like it wasn't just fluff.
Yeah.
They really were trying to connect in some way, shape, or form. Chrissy, I want to thank you for coming on here. This evolved into such a beautiful conversation, I think just about like the spectrum of intimacy, how we might allow it in our lives. You offered so many tangible examples that I'm really excited for people to hear. Do you have any final parting thoughts for everybody?
What's coming up right now is there's something really special about, for me personally, my niche, if you will, is play. And there's something really special about being playful with people. Silly, quirky, weird, like let people see you're weird. Because at least for me, my most fun, fulfilling relationships are the ones where I've been weird and people are like, oh, let's be weird together. And it's like, let's get weird. There are people out there that really want to get weird with you in whatever way that, however you make meaning out of that. Those are the most fun and fulfilling relationships, in my opinion. So have a play with being playful with people. It softens people's defense mechanisms. It invites playfulness forward. And I think it's such a beautiful opening when it comes to making new connections.
I love that. I think we could all, as adults, lean more into play. I think that's a great way to leave people. This episode was dense. This one was full, again, of those gems. So many different ways that you could integrate this in your life, ideas for how to make shifts, approaches. Like, I love it. We have options here. And that's why I want to remind you that this is a process. Please do not feel like you need to go and implement all of these ideas at once. In fact, do not implement all of these ideas at once. That would be so overwhelming. So here's what I suggest instead. Pick one small way to make a change and then try it. See how it goes, see how it feels. If that feels good, maybe keep doing it, make it a regular thing. If it doesn't feel right, that is okay. Choose another idea and experiment with that. Remember, Chrissy talked about being playful. Apply that same playfulness to how you integrate those approaches to the connections in your life. Now, if this episode just really connected with you, like this is a struggle you are having of always being the fixer or the pleaser or feeling like things are one-sided, I want to tell you that we have another episode that is so similar to this, but from another person's perspective. Like, please go check it out. And that is episode 85, Shifting People-Pleasing Patterns with Deb Blum. Again, we talk all about one-sided relationships and how to change those friendship patterns that are no longer serving you. I want to thank Chrissy for being here. Head to the show notes. Most importantly, thanks for being here. I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Friendship IRL. I am so honored to have these conversations with you, but don't let the chat die here. Send me a voice message. I created a special website just to chat with you. You can find it at alex.chat. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle at it's Alex Alexander, or go ahead and leave a review wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Now, if you want to take this conversation a step further, send this episode to a friend. Tell them you found it interesting and use what we just talked about as a conversation starter the next time you and your friend hang out. No need for a teary goodbye. I'll be back with a new episode next week.